a small village tucked between dusty roads and endless fields lived a girl named Meher. Her world was simple, shaped by early mornings, the scent of wet soil, and the distant hum of passing trains. Life hadn't handed her luxury or ease, but it had gifted her with a heart full of dreams. Every night, under a worn-out ceiling, she'd stare at the stars and imagine a life beyond the boundaries of her world. A life where she could choose her own path, speak her own truth, and be someone people respected. Meher lived with her parents and 2 younger siblings in a modest mud brick home. Her father worked as a daily wage labourer, often returning late with aching limbs and silence in his eyes. Her mother was a quiet woman, hardened by the weight of poverty and unfulfilled hopes. Yet, despite the bleakness, Meher found small moments of joy, helping her siblings with their schoolwork, reading borrowed books, or simply dreaming while watching the wind dance through the wheat fields. From a young age, Meher had learned to be responsible. She cooked, cleaned, and often helped her mother sew clothes for neighbours. Her parents, though loving in their own ways, never encouraged her ambitions. Education was considered a luxury they couldn't afford beyond the basics, especially for a girl. Still, Meher held on to her dreams with quiet determination. She longed to become a teacher, to move to the city, to wear clothes she picked for herself, and to write her own story. What made Meher different from others in her village was the way she looked at life, not with bitterness, but with hope. She saw possibilities where others saw dead ends. Even when her hands were rough from chores and her feet sore from walking miles to fetch water, her mind wandered into a future painted with bright colours. She imagined herself standing in front of a classroom, guiding young minds, being addressed with respect. It was this vision that kept her going when everything else seemed uncertain. But in her world, dreams were not always allowed to grow. They were trimmed, shaped, and often buried under tradition and survival. For a girl like Meher, marriage was considered the final destination, not a chapter in a bigger journey. Whenever relatives came over, they'd whisper about finding her a good match. She'd smile politely, but her heart would sink a little deeper each time. She wasn't ready to give up on her dreams. Not yet. What she didn't know was that life had its own plan, one that would test her in ways she never imagined, a plan that would shatter her illusions, force her into silence, and then slowly guide her toward a truth buried deep beneath the surface of her broken hopes. It was a quiet afternoon when Meher's life began to shift in a way she couldn't understand yet. Her mother had just returned from the market with an odd sparkle in her eyes, one that Meher hadn't seen in years. That evening, the house buzzed with a tension Meher couldn't place. Her father, usually silent and withdrawn after work, was oddly attentive. Her mother made tea twice. Something was coming, and Meher could feel it deep in her chest. The next day, a family came to visit. They arrived in a white car that stood out like a jewel in the dusty village lanes. The man at the centre of it all was someone Meher had never met before, clean-shaven, confident, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place in their humble courtyard. His name was Raheel. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with a kind of soft authority that made people listen. His mother did most of the talking, praising her son's job in the city, his stable income, and how he was now ready to settle down with a simple, respectful girl. Meher sat in the corner, her head bowed, her heart racing. The proposal came quickly, as if the family had already made their decision. Rahil's mother said Maya had the kind of face and manners they'd been searching for. She promised they would treat her like a daughter, that Maya would live a life of comfort. No more chores, no more poverty, no more worrying about money. It sounded like a dream to everyone else in the room. To Maya, it felt like a storm. Her parents looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between them. For a moment, her father's eyes softened as he looked at her, perhaps imagining that this was the moment he could finally give his daughter the life he never could. Her mother whispered, "We won't get a better offer than this." No one asked Maya how she felt. Inside, her heart was a battlefield. On one side was fear. Fear of leaving everything behind, of marrying a stranger, of losing her freedom. On the other was guilt. The thought of disappointing her parents, of being ungrateful, of letting go of the only chance she might get at a better life. She wanted to say she wasn't ready, that she still had dreams to chase. But the words got stuck somewhere between her throat and her silence. That night, she stared at the stars just like she used to. But they didn't comfort her the same way. They looked distant, like they were fading away. A week later, the engagement was done. Maya wore a borrowed dress and a forced smile. Her hands were decorated with henna, but her heart felt bare. Everyone said she was lucky, that she was stepping into a golden future. She wanted to believe them. She really tried, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "This isn't the life you chose." The wedding came and went like a blur. The rituals, the noise, the relatives, all passed Meher by as though she were watching someone else live her life. The first time she stepped into Rahil's house, it was as if she had walked into a museum. Everything polished, expensive, and eerily silent. Her new home had marble floors, shining chandeliers, and walls too clean to touch. But somehow, it felt colder than the mud brick house she had left behind. In the early days, everyone was kind, but distant. Her mother-in-law instructed her on how to dress, how to speak, how to walk. She was told not to laugh too loudly, not to speak unless spoken to, and to always lower her eyes around guests. Even in the kitchen, she wasn't allowed to cook without permission. "You're not in your village anymore," they reminded her often, as if her roots were something shameful. Rahil, too, was not the man he had appeared to be. He was polite in front of others, but distant in private. He didn't speak much unless it was to give instructions. What she should wear to a gathering, how she should greet his friends, how much salt to put in his food. There were no conversations, no curiosity about her thoughts or her dreams. If she ever brought up her desire to study or work, he'd shut her down with a quiet, dismissive, "We'll see," followed by silence that lingered like a warning. The first time she asked if she could visit her parents, he told her, "There's no need to go so soon. You have a new home now." The second time she asked, he didn't respond at all. Slowly, the walls closed in. She wasn't allowed to have a phone. Her in-laws said it was unnecessary and distracting. She wasn't allowed to go out alone, not even to the corner store. If she smiled too long at a guest or took too long in the shower, her mother-in-law would raise an eyebrow, and Rahil would ask quiet, sharp questions later. Everything she did was monitored, and though no one ever shouted, the silence became its own form of punishment. She began to shrink. Gone were the long walks in the wheat fields, the books she used to borrow, the sound of her siblings laughing. Her days became a loop of chores, quiet meals, and pretending to be fine. Every now and then, she'd look in the mirror and not recognize the girl staring back at her, dressed in silk, draped in gold, but hollow-eyed and silent. This wasn't the life she had dreamed of. She had traded poverty for comfort, yes, but at the cost of her voice, her freedom, and slowly, her sense of self. It was a beautiful prison, and she was its most obedient prisoner. The house was never empty, yet Meher had never felt so alone. Every morning, the same routine unfolded like clockwork. Polished floors, silent meals, eyes watching her every move. Her mother-in-law's voice echoed through the halls, not in anger, but in a calm, calculated way that made Meher second-guess even her most innocent actions. A cup placed too loudly on the table, a scarf slightly askew, a few extra seconds spent in the garden. Nothing escaped notice, and everything seemed to carry hidden meaning. Rahil came home late most nights, tired and uninterested. He never asked how her day was, never noticed the sadness she didn't know how to hide anymore. He was courteous, never cruel, but that only made it harder. His silence wasn't sharp like a knife. It was dull, heavy, and constant. Sometimes she wished he'd raise his voice, just so she could feel something real. Instead, there was only the empty politeness of strangers living under the same roof. She missed laughter. She missed warmth. She missed being seen. When she tried to reach out, to speak to Rahil, to share her thoughts, he would listen with an absent look, nodding just enough to seem present, before changing the topic or leaving the room altogether. If she lingered, if she asked too many questions, he'd tighten his jaw slightly and say, "Why do you always want more? Isn't this enough for you?" She had food, clothes, a roof over her head. But not once did anyone ask if she was happy. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You're lucky, Meher. Not every girl gets a life like this." But if this was luck, why did it feel so much like loss? The manipulation wasn't loud, it was quiet, woven into the smallest moments. She wasn't told she couldn't speak to her old friends. She was just told they wouldn't understand her new life. She wasn't banned from going out. It just became so difficult to get permission that she stopped asking. Over time, the isolation grew so naturally, so invisibly, that she began to question whether it had been her own choice all along. Some nights, lying in the softest bed she'd ever known, she'd feel like screaming. But there was no one to hear it. She began to write in secret, small notes she hid under the mattress, letters to herself, to the girl she used to be. She wrote about the fields, the sky, the laughter of her siblings. And slowly, her desire to break free took root, not like a loud rebellion, but like a quiet flame refusing to die. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know how or when. But deep inside, she began to realize that a life lived in silence wasn't really a life at all. And somewhere beneath the weight of silk and silence, Meher began to wake up. It began with a phone call. Meher wasn't supposed to answer the landline, but one afternoon when no one else was home, it rang endlessly. Out of instinct, she picked it up. The voice on the other end was a woman, unfamiliar and sharp. "Rahil's not answering his phone. Tell him Sana called." Before Meher could respond, the line went dead. Sana. The name lingered long after the dial tone faded. Rahil had never mentioned Asana. Meher stood there for a long moment, the receiver still in her hand, her heart beginning to race with questions she couldn't yet form. Over the next few days, little things started to reveal themselves. Things she had overlooked before. Receipts in Rahil's pockets from places he claimed not to have visited. His phone lighting up at odd hours with messages he quickly deleted. The tension in his voice when he took calls in another room, always locking the door behind him. Once, she accidentally opened a drawer in his study while cleaning and found a small velvet box. Inside was a gold bracelet, clearly new, clearly meant for someone. Her birthday was months away, and there had been no special occasion mentioned. She quietly closed the drawer, her mind swirling. Raheel had always been private, but now his secrecy felt calculated, intentional. When she finally gathered the courage to ask him about the bracelet, his reaction was chillingly calm. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "You're overthinking again, Meher. You always do this. Just trust me." But trust had started to crack. She began to watch more closely. The way his mother seemed to glance at him during dinner when certain topics came up. The quick exchanges between him and a cousin who visited too frequently. Whispers in the hallway that stopped when she entered. Every small oddity that once felt coincidental now seemed part of something larger, something carefully hidden. Meher wasn't confrontational by nature. She had spent years staying quiet, being good, trying not to upset the delicate balance of her home. But the silence was turning heavy. She no longer feared what she might find. She feared staying in the dark forever. At night, when everyone else was asleep, she started going through old documents, photos, drawers, anywhere that might hold a clue. Her hands trembled with guilt, but her mind kept pushing forward. Each inconsistency she uncovered became a thread she couldn't stop pulling. And with each pull, the carefully curated image of her life with Raheel began to unravel. She didn't know the full truth yet, but one thing had become clear. Something was being kept from her. Something that went far beyond a forgotten name or a hidden gift. And Meher, once quiet and obedient, was no longer content with the version of reality she had been given. Meher's heart pounded as she scrolled through the unlocked phone she had found charging in the study, Raheel's second phone. She hadn't even known it existed until she accidentally discovered it tucked away beneath a stack of files. Her hands shook as she opened the message thread at the top. Sana. The conversation was weeks long, not professional, not distant. The language was intimate, filled with terms of endearment, late-night plans, promises, and even complaints about the dead weight at home. Meher's chest tightened as she realized those words were about her. She felt the floor shift beneath her, but she kept reading. There were more messages from other women, some casual, some clearly ongoing. Her vision blurred. She had never imagined this. Not from Raheel, the man her family had praised as stable, well-mannered and respectable. Her mind reeled back to the way he had shut her down, told her she was imagining things. The gaslighting hadn't been subtle, it had been constant. The next day, she waited for him to leave and made her way to the room where her mother-in-law kept old documents and wedding files. She'd always been told not to touch anything in there, which now seemed like another red flag. Meher dug slowly, methodically, until she found a bundle of papers folded into a leather file. What she read next made her blood run cold. Bank documents, credit card statements, and legal papers with unfamiliar names, but with Raheel's signature. There were loans taken out using forged documents, multiple accounts under false identities, and transactions that hinted at money laundering. Some of them dated back to before their marriage. It was no wonder he had kept her from opening a bank account or knowing anything about their finances. The wealth she had admired wasn't earned, it was built on deception. Later that evening, when Raheel returned home, she studied him with a different lens. His composed face, his tidy clothes, his calm tone, everything was a carefully constructed mask. A part of her wanted to confront him right then and there, to scream and throw the phone at his feet. But another part of her, the part that had learned to survive in silence, told her to wait. to understand everything first. That night, she called her cousin Farah, someone she hadn't spoken to in months. Carefully, in half-truths and cautious words, she asked if Farah had ever heard anything odd about Raheel or his family. Farah was quiet for a long time before replying. "I didn't want to say anything back then," she said, her voice hesitant. "But there were rumours about Raheel being involved in shady property deals in the city, and about some woman who filed a complaint that never went anywhere." Meher sat still, the phone pressed to her ear, her mind spinning. Her entire marriage, it seemed, had been built on lies. She wasn't just unwanted, she was a convenient cover. A respectable village girl who made Raheel appear settled and traditional, while he continued his double life in the city. The promises his family made were not for her. They were for appearances, for hiding a truth that might otherwise damage Raheel's reputation and deals. Her dreams, her identity, her life had been collateral damage in someone else's plan. But something had shifted in Meher now. She was no longer afraid of the truth. The more she learned, the more her silence turned into resolve. She had lived too long under someone else's illusion. Now, it was time to reclaim her reality, no matter the cost. Meher didn't explode. She didn't scream, throw plates, or confront Raheel in a dramatic outburst. Instead, she became very quiet and very focused. It began with small acts, the kind no one noticed at first. She started writing everything down, every date, every document, every strange transaction she came across. She memorized passwords, copied files onto a USB hidden in her old sewing kit. At night, when everyone slept, she researched laws on inheritance, divorce, and women's rights. The same girl who once accepted silence as safety now sought knowledge like armor. She reached out to Farah again, this time with more detail. Farah didn't hesitate. "You don't have to stay there, Meher. Whatever you need, I'm here." For the first time in what felt like years, someone believed her without doubting, without judgment. That one thread of support gave her more strength than she imagined. She began saving small amounts of money, spare cash from the grocery budget, unnoticed coins from Raheel's pockets. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Then came the day when she refused to serve tea. It was a family gathering, and Meher was expected to smile, carry trays, and play the part of the perfect wife. But something in her shifted. When her mother-in-law told her to bring in the cups, Meher simply said, "No," calmly, without apology. The room froze. Raheel shot her a look, sharp as a blade. But she met his eyes, steady, unafraid. He didn't say a word, just clenched his jaw and looked away. Later that night, he tried to assert himself again. "You're becoming difficult, Meher. What's gotten into you?" She smiled softly. "I've started seeing things clearly." There was no anger in her voice, just quiet clarity, and that unnerved him more than any scream ever could. The next week, she visited a lawyer under the guise of going to the tailor. She sat in a cold office with trembling hands, but a steady voice. She told her story, showed the USB, the documents, the messages. The lawyer listened, then said, "You have more power than you think." Walking back home, Meher felt the sun on her face in a way she hadn't in years. It didn't matter that nothing had changed yet, not on the surface, because everything had changed inside her. She was no longer trapped by fear. She was no longer willing to sacrifice herself for the illusion of a perfect life. Her voice, long buried beneath guilt and shame, was rising, and this time she was listening to it. It happened on a rainy evening. unexpected, but somehow inevitable. Raheel had found the USB. Meher had hidden it well, but perhaps not well enough. She returned from the market to find him waiting in the living room, the device in his hand, his face unreadable. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice low, too calm. Meher's breath caught in her throat. She stood still, her wet dupatta clinging to her shoulders. She could hear the rain tapping against the windows like a warning. Her heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. "You already know what's on it," she replied, her voice steady. "So maybe it's time I asked you to explain." For a moment, he looked surprised. This wasn't the Meher he was used to. His eyes narrowed. "You've been spying on me? After everything I've done for you?" A laugh, bitter and cold, escaped her lips. "Everything you've done to me, you mean?" He stepped forward, and instinctively, she stepped back. But she didn't run. Not this time. "I have copies," she said before he could speak again. "And I've already spoken to a lawyer." Raheel's face turned pale, then dark. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I'm saving myself." The storm outside raged, as if mirroring the one between them. He hurled the USB across the room, where it shattered against the wall. But it didn't matter. He couldn't erase the truth anymore, and he knew it. That night, Meher didn't sleep. She packed her things slowly, methodically. Just the essentials. Clothes, documents, the few valuables she had hidden away. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Her body moved like it had been preparing for this moment all along. At dawn, before anyone else stirred, she slipped out of the house and into the waiting car Farah had sent. The city passed by in a blur, but she didn't look back. The legal process would be messy. Her name would be whispered in family circles, judged by people who knew nothing of her truth. There would be questions, threats, resistance. But she had crossed the line of no return, and with each step forward, the weight on her chest began to lift. By the time she reached the shelter Farah had arranged, her body was exhausted. Her eyes burned, but she was free, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. She had broken the chains no one else could see. The toll was real. Fatigue, fear, the ache of everything she had lost. But beneath it all was something else, something stronger. Peace. She stood by the window of her new room and watched the rain wash the city clean. She had made it out. And now, for the first time in years, her life truly belonged to her. In the weeks that followed, Meher discovered that freedom was not a single moment. It was a slow, uncertain journey, filled with small victories and unexpected grief. The shelter was quiet, clean, and full of women with stories stitched together by pain and resilience. Meher found comfort in their company. No one asked for details unless she wanted to share. No one judged her silence. For the first time, she didn't have to explain herself to anyone. At first, she slept lightly, waking at every creak in the hallway, expecting Raheel's voice, his presence. But with each morning that came and went without fear, she began to breathe a little deeper. Her body, once stiff with anxiety, began to relax. She no longer jumped at sudden sounds. Her hands stopped trembling. She started journaling again, not as a secret this time, but as therapy. Each word she wrote was a stitch, slowly mending the parts of her that had been torn apart. She wrote about the girl she used to be, the dreamer, the believer. And she wrote about the woman she was becoming, stronger, sharper, no longer willing to be made small. Farah visited often, bringing books, clothes, and laughter. She never pitied Meher, never treated her like she was broken. Instead, she reminded Meher of her strength over and over again, until Meher began to believe it for herself. Through legal proceedings, she learned more than she ever wanted to know about Rahil's layered deception, his network of lies, the way his family had knowingly enabled him. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal, it was the realization that so many people around her had chosen convenience over conscience. But even in that pain, Meher found clarity. She didn't need to make everyone understand. She didn't need to justify her escape. Her truth was enough. And for the first time in her life, she was enough. She started taking small freelance translation work online, something she had once dreamed of before marriage. She didn't make much, but it was hers. Her money, her work, her hours. One morning, she passed by a mirror and didn't recognize herself, not because she looked worse, but because she looked alive. Her eyes, once dulled by routine, sparkled again. Her spine was straight, her steps lighter. She had grown into someone she had never been allowed to become. Closure didn't come all at once. It came in the quiet acceptance that some chapters had to end, no matter how much love or effort you poured into them. It came in forgiving herself for not leaving sooner, in realizing that survival was not weakness, but proof of incredible strength. She wasn't just free from Rahil. She was free from the idea that suffering was something to endure in silence. That lesson alone had changed her forever, and as she looked toward the uncertain road ahead, she no longer feared what might come. She had already faced the worst and found herself on the other side. 1 year later, Meher stood in front of a classroom, whiteboard marker in hand, explaining a grammar rule to a group of eager teenage girls. Their eyes were full of questions, hope, and potential, just like hers had once been. She smiled as one of them finally understood and beamed with pride. This wasn't a prestigious job or a glamorous life. It wasn't the future her family had once imagined for her. But it was hers. Entirely hers. After everything she had been through, Meher had returned to what she once dreamed of. Education. With Farah's help and a few small scholarships, she'd enrolled in a women's learning centre. She studied English, computer skills, and even basic law. Each course chipped away at the old version of herself, the one who believed she wasn't capable, who had been told over and over that she wasn't enough. She was enough, and she was proving it every single day. The healing hadn't been quick or clean. There were still days when a certain smell, a sound, or a phrase brought back the fear. There were nights when she stared at the ceiling, wondering if she'd ever fully escape the past. But those moments were now met with strength, not silence. She had started speaking at small women's groups, sharing her story with those who were still in the middle of their battles. Her voice, once buried under layers of shame and obedience, now carried power. She didn't share her story for sympathy. She shared it so someone else might find their own turning point sooner. People often told her she was brave. She didn't always feel it, but she had learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to move forward anyway. Her relationship with her own family was still strained. Some relatives had cut ties completely, unable to handle the discomfort of her truth. But Maya no longer lived for their approval, and surprisingly, a few others had quietly come forward, apologizing, offering support, admitting they'd been wrong. Small steps, but they mattered. She now rented a modest one-room flat, decorated with second-hand books, plants, and a corkboard, covered in motivational quotes and hand-drawn doodles from her students. Her fridge was nearly always half empty, but her heart was full. Sometimes She looked back at old photographs and barely recognized the girl in them, naive, soft-spoken, dreaming of rescue. She hadn't been rescued. She had rescued herself. And in doing so, she had become the kind of woman her younger self would have admired. Independent, kind, wise, and no longer afraid of life's uncertainties. As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting a golden hue over her balcony, Meher closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. This was her new dawn. Not perfect, not easy, but completely, beautifully her own.